Hey everyone, I'm Harvest Build Destroy, and this is a channel about RTS games. In this video I'm going to talk about Ancestors Legacy, an RTS game that came out in May of this year. But before I get into it, I want to apologize in advance for the shoddy footage in the background. My computer's pretty out of date, and I can only run the game smoothly on the lowest graphics settings. If the game interests you, I encourage you to check out some other Ancestors Legacy videos, as it looks much better on a more modern machine. I'm just going to focus on the gameplay here. I think the simplest way to describe Ancestors Legacy is to say that it's kind of like Company of Heroes meets Battle for Middle-earth. If you're looking for the too long didn't watch summary, I have mixed feelings about this game. It borrows quite a bit from Company of Heroes, but just doesn't seem to possess the same level of depth. I've had a lot of fun playing it, but I don't think I'll be playing it for very long. However, Destructive Creations, the studio that made the game, is pretty new and not well known. Ancestors Legacy is only their third game and their first RTS, so despite all the things I'm going to criticize in this video, I think it's an impressive first showing and that they've done quite a lot right with the game. If they decide to make another RTS, I'll definitely be interested. Anyway, it's an historical game set at around the time of the Battle of Hastings and features 4 asymmetrical factions: the Vikings, Anglo-Saxons, Germans, and Slavs. Your units are grouped into squads, and there's a morale mechanic similar to that found in Dawn of War 1. When a squad's morale reaches 0, they get slaughtered pretty easily by almost anything. The game's macro mechanics are about as streamlined as it gets. While there is base building, you don't get to choose where your buildings go, and while there are technically worker units on the map, you don't control them yourself. Your resources are automatically added to your stockpile at a certain rate based on how much of the map you control, but it works quite a bit differently than in Company of Heroes or Dawn of War. Instead of sectors, you capture villages. To do so, you have to destroy the building at the center of a village and then stand near it uncontested by enemy units for a few seconds. But capturing villages doesn't increase your income in and of itself. Each village contains a small number of resource gathering locations, and once you've captured it, you build mining camps, lumber mills, farms, etc. to increase your resource income. You can also fortify your villages with up to 3 archer towers and recruit extra peasants to fire arrows out of the village's main building. However, if your opponent destroys the main building, all resource gathering sites and archer towers will be destroyed too. The building doesn't have a lot of health either, so getting caught out of position is a big deal in Ancestors Legacy. For this reason, villages feel a bit like grist mills in Tooth and Tail. Like Company of Heroes, the game features 3 resources: wood, food, and iron. But while I'm generally a fan of RTS economies featuring a larger number of resources, I'm not the biggest fan of how these particular 3 resources function. Wood and iron are basically like minerals and gas in StarCraft or requisition and power in Dawn of War. Almost everything costs wood, but higher tier units and global upgrades also cost iron. The other resource, food, almost isn't a resource at all. It's kind of like the built-in upkeep mechanic of manpower in Company of Heroes separated into its own resource. There are only a couple of things in the game that actually cost food up front. Each squad you control has a certain food drain rate, so you can actually have a negative food income if your squads require more food than you currently have coming in. If you reach 0 food, your squad's morale goes way down and your units die very easily. So in reality, it's more like a 2-resource economy. Food just limits the rate at which you can expand your army. I don't find it to be a particularly meaningful mechanic either. You need to build an extra house for each squad you create, which is already kind of like an upkeep mechanic, in that you have to spend extra wood for each additional unit. The food resource might have made more sense if the game was supposed to be on a larger scale. Your wood income doesn't have a cap like manpower in Company of Heroes, so hypothetically you could field a much larger army, but the squad cap is only 10. In my experience, you often end up getting bottlenecked with the other 2 resources, and food is rarely an issue. The general problem I have with the economy in Ancestors Legacy is that it feels like you have to balance too many priorities with the same resource, particularly in the case of iron. You have to spend wood or iron on the sorts of things that would cost munitions in Company of Heroes. In Company of Heroes, munitions allows you to squeeze a little extra out of your limited number of units without affecting how many units you can put into the field. In Ancestors Legacy, you can upgrade the armor of an individual squad for iron, greatly increasing their survivability, as well as place traps on the map for wood. Neither of these is anywhere near as sophisticated as their Company of Heroes equivalents, though. Company of Heroes features a pretty wide variety of weapon and armor upgrades for your different units, as well as a large number of different field emplacements and hazards, while Ancestors Legacy only features an armor upgrade and 2 types of traps. Armor is good, so you definitely want to get it, but it doesn't really change the way you use your units the way upgrading weapons in Company of Heroes does. I guess you can be a bit more aggressive, but that's about it. In Company of Heroes, fuel is only used for tech structures and vehicles, plus a very small number of global upgrades, none of which is very expensive. In Ancestors Legacy, you need to spend iron on tech structures, all units beyond your Tier 1 infantry, armor, advancing to the next tech level, and a large number of global upgrades, most of which are fairly expensive. I think it might have made more sense for food rather than iron to be the secondary resource that units cost, and to reserve iron for buildings, armor, and global upgrades. I'm not entirely sure if this would work, but I suspect it would be better than the way it is now. That way, when you spend your iron, you're deciding whether to invest in the long game, that is tech, or your immediate fighting ability, armor, without affecting your overall unit count as much. On the topic of armor, it would have been nice to see some weapon upgrades in the game too, especially weapons that affect the way you use your units. But anyway, by spending food instead of iron on units, your economy would require more planning, as you would have to prioritize which tech resource to invest in first based on what you wanted to do. I think it would also incentivize players to fight over particular resources. Based on what your opponent is doing, it may be a better choice to focus on denying them wood, food, or iron. You can already do this, but the distinction between the resources just doesn't seem as important the way it is now. Being able to choose where you place your buildings might help with this too, as would increasing the number and sophistication of the traps your squads can build. In general, my issues with Ancestors Legacy are similar to what I said about Dawn of War 1 in my video on Company of Heroes. Dawn of War simplified RTS macro mechanics without really increasing the complexity anywhere else to compensate. Ancestors Legacy ends up feeling like a simplistic version of Company of Heroes with swords to me, which is a shame, because I think a game like this could be pretty interesting if properly executed. But the combat just doesn't feel anywhere near as deep. There aren't any global castable abilities either, which to be fair makes sense in a medieval setting, but from a gameplay perspective might have been a good idea. Because of how the combat works, there isn't really much to do in the game. I know not everyone wants RTS games to be as mechanically difficult as I do, but Ancestors Legacy seems to cross the line of being too mechanically easy. As I was playing it, I found myself thinking that a player using an Xbox controller wouldn't be at that much of a disadvantage against someone using a mouse and keyboard. I've since found out that the game will indeed be coming out on Xbox One next year, so there you go. I'm not the biggest fan of the idea of console RTS, but I could imagine Ancestors Legacy working decently well with a gamepad. In some ways, it seems like the game might have been designed with console viability in mind from the get-go. For example, if you zoom in all the way with the squad selected, the heads-up display disappears and you get a cinematic view of the battle. It looks pretty cool even on the lowest graphic settings, but it's not exactly something you're going to want to do in the middle of a competitive multiplayer match. It seems more like a chillin' on the couch kind of thing. Anyway, when your units enter combat, they stick together and you can't move them anymore. You can still use abilities or the retreat function, but that's it. To me, battles feel a bit like instances in an RPG, or like a turn-based strategy game that just so happens to take place in real time. There is some strategy involved in how you engage in the first place, though. When you right-click an enemy squad, you receive a charge bonus upon entering combat, so catching your opponent off guard will give you an advantage. Most maps feature tall grass like in League of Legends for setting up ambushes. Cavalry in particular receive a significant charge bonus, and flanking your opponent from the rear or side with any type of squad gives you a bonus too. Ranged units can friendly fire if your units are in the way, so you'll have to move them around to get a clear shot. This is one of the most effective tactics in the game in my experience. Tie up your opponent's melee units with your own, move around the side with archers and slaughter them. It's also good to keep a squad or two of cavalry waiting in the wings to charge your opponent's ranged units. As for the combat itself, squads have types like in Pokemon and are strong and weak to certain other types. But compared to Company of Heroes, it just doesn't feel like you have the power to influence the battles so much. In Company of Heroes, you're constantly repositioning your units in the middle of a battle to manipulate the RNG based on the terrain of the map. But in Ancestors Legacy, you just try and engage at the best angle you can, and from there it's kind of like fighting mobs in World of Warcraft. It's generally pretty obvious when you should use your abilities. I really do like the idea of a Company of Heroes style game with swords, though. It would be cool to see a game like Ancestors Legacy incorporate a cover system and allow you to continue to reposition melee squads in the middle of combat. I think it would also be really cool if squads could change stances in combat. For example, a squad of spearmen could raise their shields to block a volley of arrows, or form a circle and raise their spears to repel a cavalry charge. If units could still move in combat, little things like this, which would have advantages and disadvantages, would reward players who adapted to different situations on the fly. There are stances in Ancestors Legacy already, but you can only change them before you enter combat. The fact that the primary resource wood isn't rate limited like manpower in Company of Heroes is also something that I think could have been interesting if the game's combat was a bit more fleshed out. Company of Heroes is all about how small numbers of units interact, but I think in a medieval setting with more melee units and friendly fire for ranged units, a larger number of units per player could have ended up working pretty well, and probably would have been a lot of fun. The functions of the game's resources might need to change a bit to accommodate this sort of thing, but it's an idea that appeals to me. But as I mentioned at the outset of this video, I do think Ancestors Legacy has done some things right. I really like the village capturing mechanic. One of the things I don't like as much about Company of Heroes is that since its objective is King of the Hill style, you hardly ever end up attacking your opponent's base. While it's rare to attack your opponent's main base in Ancestors Legacy 2, the village mechanic feels a lot more like the traditional RTS dynamic of attacking enemy bases, and feels pretty satisfying to me. I also really like how the resource buildings are scattered around the village, so you can deny your opponent a particular resource without having to actually take the village. The building burning mechanic is also kind of interesting. Instead of hitting buildings with their swords, your squads throw torches at enemy buildings, which initially don't damage the building itself, but rather fill up a red bar that represents the degree to which a building's on fire. Once the bar is full, the building's health will slowly drain until the fire is put out, even if you stop attacking it. Once a building is burnt down, the rubble will remain on fire for a while, and the building can't be rebuilt until the fire goes out. The campaigns are also very well done. There are 2 6-mission campaigns for each faction, and the missions are generally fairly long and multifaceted. They're not purely glorified tutorials, but you do get the opportunity to use the entire tech tree of all 4 factions. I like the art style of the cutscenes too, although they're cartoony enough that you could almost forget that it's an historical rather than fantasy game. If you're looking for a casual RTS campaign experience, the game is probably worth picking up. I think 4 is the right number of factions to have in the game too. This might seem like a strange thing to praise, but I think this is a pretty big mistake that a lot of RTS developers make, including too many asymmetrical factions in one game. 4 is enough that there's plenty of variety, but not so much that the game is daunting to learn or impossible to balance. Although, to be fair, if the game's combat was as fleshed out as I'd like, it might have the same sort of learning curve problem as Company of Heroes. On the learning curve front, the unit type system cuts back on this quite a bit. Even if you don't know the specifics of what a particular unit does, you can see its type, as well as what types it's good and bad against, and have a decent idea of how to fight against it. But in general, I find it hard not to think about the game that Ancestors Legacy could have been while I'm playing the game that it actually is. The reason I ended up trying it in the first place was that it was free for a few days on Steam recently. During that time, it was 50% off to buy, so I bought it. But if it hadn't been for that sale, I'm not entirely sure that I would have. It's a well-made game, but it's definitely more on the casual side, and that's not really my thing. If a less demanding modern RTS in this particular setting appeals to you, you may find a lot to like here, especially if you're looking for a single-player campaign. But for me, Ancestors Legacy mostly just makes me want to play more Company of Heroes. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, rate, comment, subscribe, share, and hit the notifications bell. See you soon.